Hi, and welcome back to the Mob Mentality Show. My name is Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we have Esther Derby with us, and we're going to be talking about things like rethinking management and nurturing change in organizations. But first, Esther, can you maybe give a little bit of an introduction for yourself, and then we can get going?
Sure. So I started my professional career as a programmer, and I realized fairly early that while my job description talked about writing code and testing code and putting code into production, that really a lot of my job involved changing people's work. And so I got interested in change because of that, and started noticing what it took to change things in organizations and how change affected people. I mean, so one of the first programs I wrote, it changed someone's job significantly, and they really didn't like it. Made it faster, made it easier, but they really liked the old way of doing things. So it was an interesting thing to notice that early in a technical career. And because I was good at programming, eventually I was promoted to be a manager, which is actually not a promotion, it's a job change. A career change, and it's a completely different set of skills. So I had to, learn a completely different set of skills and look at change from that perspective. So, yeah, so I spent a lot of time thinking about change and thinking about management, and that's what we're here to talk about.
All right, sounds good. Well, we can kind of dive into the first topic. Just rethinking management. So kind of what did you mean by that? What do you want to get into there?
Well, I still occasionally hear managers say, my job isn't to make people happy. My job is to get people to work hard. And I think that attitude, while it's not often said that directly, that is one of the underlying assumptions of our whole model of business and organizations. And there are some assumptions that go with that, which is that if people are not supervised, they won't work hard, they'll slack off. And I think that is both deeply disrespectful. It's also rather inhumane and awfully ineffective.
Yeah, is that kind of like the theory X, theory Y management styles sort of thing? Like, observing metrics about someone and then punishing them for bad behavior, poor performance versus, working towards a better environment, that sort of thing.
Well, it's related to it in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
It is related to it, although I think it's important to explicitly acknowledge the underpinnings of management that we often don't think about, which was it as a profession emerged to extract maximum labor and maximum value from other humans. And so that, I think, is, kind of baked into some of the assumptions behind the practices that we use. So while it's nice to say, oh, we have to think about a different theory of management, I think we also have to look at what are the assumptions of the existing structures, because if we don't pay attention to those, they just reassert themselves.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, definitely. I think getting at the root is really important. And so I heard you address the goal is to work hard, is to supervise and extract value. And so if you were to replace those things, what would you replace them with if you were kind of addressing kind of the deeper philosophical goals of management, I guess?
Well, create an environment where it's easy for people to do the right thing and do great work.
Gotcha.
Right. And so it's just a very different focus. How can we create an environment where doing great work and being creative is just kind of a natural outcome of the environment we have created, that people bring their own tendency towards creativity and generativity to the workplace easily.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice. Yeah. So
Like, but it's actually, there's a lot of research that says that people who are not stressed and who feel valued and who have some agency are actually more productive and more creative.
yeah. And I think what I suspect, going back in time when I adopted some of the assumptions early in my career that you were talking about and kind of just thought about that way, because that's the only game in town for management, so to speak, right? I wasn't myself a manager, but just thought that that's the way it was. I guess one gut reaction to, just create a good environment is, well, what does that look like? Like, you just like let them do whatever they want. You have no review, no, so I think, what is your response to that kind of gut reaction to let's focus on creating a good environment? Yeah.
Well, it's not all about foosball tables and ping pong tables and free lunch or having a beer tap at work. Although that seems to be what some people think is a great environment. So I think about it as, teams, do better when they have a handful of conditions, right? They have a clear goal. They know who they can count on. They have a set of constraints that allow them freedom, but keep them from flailing because they have too many choices or too many decisions to make. They have the access to the material they need to do their work. They have access to the information they need to do their work. And then, it's likely that they're going to do well. They have some feedback loops so they can self-correct. But when those things are present, it's much more likely that collaboration and teamwork is going to emerge and creativity is going to emerge naturally from that situation. I think one of the most important things that managers can do is, when you talk about information and understanding how your work fits in. I had a conversation a while ago with an executive who was bemoaning the fact that he couldn't find anyone who could take initiative anymore. He said, I used to be able to find people who could just run with it, take initiative and do stuff. And now everybody I hire just waits around to be told what to do. And I suspect that that is not a personal characteristic of those people. It's related to the fact that knowledge tends to bifurcate in organizations, where the people at the top understand the context and the market and the customers and the difference they're trying to make. And the people at the bottom know how to do the technical stuff or the frontline stuff that they're doing. And there's very little overlap. I think of it as two little overlapping triangles, and there's a little diamond in the middle where there's overlap. And if we want to actually have people who can take initiative, right, and can make decisions at a local level, you have to make that diamond bigger. So the shared pool of understanding about context is greater, and the understanding of capacity is greater.
Nice. Oh, right on. And I guess one temptation I've seen from maybe from a distance, but I've seen it in organizations before, is someone is, oh wow, yeah, that seems like a better way to do things, and then, okay, I'm going to command and control it into being. Yeah. So, let's say someone is convinced on kind of the why of this style of management. How do you suggest someone who's in an organization that's very much in this, maybe more traditional way of thinking, start to impact the organization to act differently?
Well, I think you have to do it carefully and incrementally. There's an interesting paper. It's been around for a long time. It's from a sausage company, where I'd have to look up the title of it.
We can always include it in the show notes later.
Yeah, so the owner of this company decided, oh, command and control is, it's just not the way to go, and people will be more creative and happier and more productive if we have a different style of working. And so he imposed that on people. And one, that's not what they had signed up for. And two, it was the same experience of, you're telling me how to do my job and how to be. So it is still, a command and control thing. And so that incongruity really got in the way. And this paper describes how he realized that and set about shifting the culture in his organization in a different way that was more inclusive and involved more people, right, in what they wanted things to be like. There was another instance where someone was telling me about, there was a corporate goal to be much more inclusive and to not have this strict layer of management. So they devolved a lot of the management responsibilities to the technical teams. In this case, I think they were oil field technicians. Wasn't software, but so they distributed all those management tasks to the team members, and suddenly people started quitting because they didn't want to do administrative reports.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't want to do all of that stuff. They wanted to do their technical work, and this thing was imposed on them. And they went to a far more command and control organization where they could at least do the technical work that they really loved. So, there is an inherent contradiction in trying to do this in a top-down way. I think you can start with the intention, but then I think it works best when you can let people get their fingerprints on the change, so that they're involved in thinking about, how are we going to take on more responsibility? How are we going to take on more decisions rather than just dumping it on people? I mean, there's this weird kind of up-down dynamic that happens when you just dump things on people who have been in a very controlled environment, because they're hesitant to take a step because they have spent so long asking for permission. And so they hesitate. And then the manager says, well, if you won't make a decision, I'll come in and make it for you. And then they're convinced that, oh, you didn't really mean it. And so it can create that dynamic. So I think it has to be done incrementally. It has to be done with involvement. But there are a lot of things you can do other than dump empowerment on people, which, I mean, when you put it that way, it just sounds so ridiculous, but yet it is what a lot of organizations do.
At one point, I had, so we'd kind of been forming a new department, and one thing we had done was just created a kind of a management related Kanban. And so it was just like tasks that could be picked up, and I was essentially the only one picking up tasks from that. And then a lot of people started taking them on, but it was kind of that same effect you described, where it was like a lot of people were doing less technical work. And so then we kind of realized that we actually need to limit the throughput of how much actual quote unquote management related work needed to get done. And then that evolved later into other systems. But it was just really funny because the Kanban was interesting because it had it ended up having an unlimited amount of work on it. And so it was like, oh, okay, now somebody can pick something up. And so it was kind of, it grew to monopolize time to a certain extent. So that was really interesting. And then putting kind of total hour limits on it, I think, fix the problem. But it was kind of an interesting experiment in that direction. And then in reality, I think a lot of it may be related to just habits. I think one thing that I do pretty often is it's just, can I involve more people? So I always, on my personal Kanban, I do have a could I bring in others to do whatever has come up? And more often than not, the answer is yes. And then that can incrementally do that sort of thing. So kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a really interesting experiment. And it makes me wonder, what do we think of as management work?
Yeah.
What falls into that bucket?
Yeah, and that's a good question, because I think of it as multiple layers of stuff, right? And so there is whatever the requirement of the company is for like HR related stuff, right? So like that's like, so maybe you're a group out there and you have maybe you have a software team, and you have a greater organization that's doing other things other than software. And so you're kind of like this little bubble, this little ecosystem. And so there's stuff that's required from the outside, and then there's things that are inside. And so one way I look at it is, what are the minimum things required from the outside, and then segment that off compared to whatever's on the inside of the bubble.
Sure.
And then and then you get into things. So ignoring the stuff on the outside, then there's a lot of stuff where it's like, I think really traditional management is like, what is somebody going to do next? What is, how are they going to do that work? Who are they going to interact with to get that work done? And those are things that the team themselves could decide, and create processes themselves around and all that other stuff. But more often than not, a manager will come in and decide for everyone how those things will work. And I think that maybe that's where this idea of rethinking management comes in.
Yeah. Well, I think about the core functions of management are to work on the system and to develop people. Yeah. So, and sometimes I talk about that as enabling and enhancing. So enabling people to do great work, enhancing the ability of the system to function smoothly. And that, I think, is an interesting focusing thing, because it doesn't talk about assigning work.
Yeah.
It doesn't talk about supervision, right? I mean, it's a fallacy that the only feedback mechanism is the manager telling somebody how things are going. I think it's really important to build feedback into the work. And, when you're delivering in small increments, you get that. When you have customer feedback, you get that. So people can course correct without necessarily having to have a manager talk to them and supervise them closely. But the other thing is like the developing people part. You couldn't think of that as an HR thing.
Many managers do, right? They say, our organizational development team is responsible for making our employees better. But they like that team is going to know in general for the company maybe what that is, but
yeah,
like especially technical stuff.
Yeah, well, and the processes I see come out of HR departments tend to be very long cycles. We have our yearly or our quarterly, if you're lucky, quarterly conversation about performance, and we have a yearly career development conversation. And career development happens in small conversations that take place, daily, weekly, maybe in a little more formal way, quarterly, but those kinds of conversations, I think, just can get woven into any interaction you're having. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, I've seen organizations where, I've been in organizations where the manager does all the things, Christian, you just talked about, or HR does it. And then I've been in ones where teams take on those things. Yeah, they're deciding how they work. They're deciding how work gets, prioritized. They've taken on the ability to develop each other. It's part of their goals, and that they've agreed to, that they've chosen to take on, is to help others grow and give feedback and those kind of things. I guess one counterexample that I'm interested in, because, and I'm not sure how to define management either management type work either. I like your definition with it's like you work on the people in the system, but then there's things like we need to hire somebody, or this documentation needs to be filled out for, company policy XYZ that's not directly related to product development, let's say. How, and I like what you said also, that you want to be searching for people to build competency and then build autonomy, people who want to do the work. But what happens when there's work that needs to be done, just because, part of being a company, some of the stuff has to be done, and people don't want to do it? Is it just whoever's left holding the bag up the chain? Or, what are your kind of thoughts on that kind of scenario?
On a team level, or you're talking about some of the administrative work that often nobody loves to do?
I'm thinking more of the latter. Yeah.
Well, you look at it and say, is it really necessary? It's a lot of the stuff that that it seems to be required. There's no legal requirement for it. There's no there might be a policy. I mean, I talked to one person who said, well, we have to have a yearly performance review because then managers are forced to give feedback at least once a year. And so if that's your policy, I mean, you've got a bigger problem. And people filling out the sheets saying, or the tick box on their screen saying, yes, I did a performance review with this person and it's on file in triplicate. That's, but that sort of tick box isn't going to solve the real problem. Yeah. Right? It's the ongoing conversation that's going to deal with the issue. Right. So I look at, is it necessary? What are you really trying to accomplish? And does this paperwork in any way contribute to it? And very often it doesn't.
Yeah. So one thought I have there too is that, just because it's not important to the person doing it, it might be viewed as important by someone else, and that also might be maybe a token of influence with them as well. So if you're talking about influencing change in an organization, and you're maybe that is also not the biggest fight in front of you, right? And so sometimes that sort of stuff ends up being good to do so that you can have a easier conversation about something more important to change. So that's
sure. And if there is a legitimate reason that something is important, of course, then you say, I understand. I understand that from the requirements of your job. That makes a ton of sense. So, which says maybe there should have been a conversation earlier.
Yeah.
But there's a whole host of things that in organizations that got done just because, and I have a piece of paper. What purpose does that paper solve?
Yeah.
What greater goal does it accomplish? We can tick another box. Well, why are we ticking that box? What are we really trying to accomplish with that?
Yeah. Root cause. Well, how do we change these things? How do we nurture change in organizations, which happens to be our next topic at exactly the right time we should talk about it.
Yeah, well, carefully, right? I mean, some of these things, it's, you like these HR policies are very difficult to change. You have to get the approval of, 17 vice presidents. But I think there are often things you can do to contextualize things and work around them in a way that accomplishes what you need to, and you may have to deal with that process on some level. I mean, there's one client I worked with, their job descriptions implicitly devalued collaboration and cross-functional work. I mean, this is very, very common.
Yeah.
And changing those definitions, I mean, it would have taken pretty much an act of God. So what we did in that case was we contextualized it to in our group, this is what this looks like.
Mhm.
And, in our group, achieving technical excellence means that you are helping more junior people develop their technical skills. Right. So taking some of the focus off the individual stuff. I mean, there are a whole bunch of different ways we said this is what it looks like in our organization, because we weren't going to be able to change those job descriptions.
Yeah. And I think I've liked that, and I've seen that work well. It's almost like kind of like a grassroots, walled off might be too strong, but there's almost some sort of like facade pattern going on, right? Where it's like, when the rest of the company says X, Y, and Z, here's what we mean by it in this group over here, right? And I've seen that work well, but because it allows experimentation and change to occur without an act of God, as you said, without having risky conversations that involve, 17 vice presidents, as you said. There is a part of it that I've seen made people feel uneasy, like, hey, we're off doing things differently than the rest of the company over here. Have you ever dealt with that, and how have you coached that?
Well, I think there is a fallacy that everything has to be consistent across an entire organization. I think they have to be coherent, but I don't think it has to be the same in every single part of the organization. I mean, there may be some exceptions to that. There are some ethical things that there's probably, this is just the way we do things everywhere. We do not threaten our colleagues.
Yeah.
Which you may wonder why that came to mind, because I've seen that happen. But so there are probably some that are universal, but in most systems over a certain size, there are lots of different ways things work. Right. I mean, the whole idea that everything has to be the same across the whole organization is a very mechanistic view, and doesn't reflect the complexity of the organizations we work in. So, I try to talk about, well, what's the same and what's different about these groups, and why would we want to do it slightly differently in this group? And then you set up sort of guardrails that says, okay, this is the intent we're trying to accomplish, and this is what we don't want to have happen. This is what these are the kind of the abhorrent things that we absolutely don't want to have happen. And then within there, we have freedom. So we're accomplishing the goal, of, in the example of the contextualizing the job descriptions, of people understanding their work and being able to think about, well, what do I need to accomplish in my job? But it was coherent with an area that was trying to work in a very collaborative, cross-functional way.
Yeah, and I've seen that too. Like it's almost analogous. Maybe the light bulb's going off for me. So like in product development, if you're delivering daily and you're providing value, usually stakeholders or customers don't really care how you're delivering it, right? They back off more on like micromanaging, and concern about how you're doing it, whether you're pairing, ensembling, mobbing, or TDD or not TDD. It's like they're just like, oh, I just see value coming out consistently for years. This is happy outcomes, right? And maybe there's a corollary with organizational change, is that if in an organization they see the output of this bubble being continuously good, they're going to care less about consistency and everything being the same, and following a traditional style of thinking. And
I mean, that works often, doesn't always work. I mean, because sometimes it's like, oh, you're doing so well over there, you're making the rest of us look bad, so stop. We must quash this. I mean, that does happen. And there are organizations where the belief that everything has to be the same everywhere is very, very strong, which leads to all sorts of inefficiencies. I mean, if everything is the same, then fine, make it the same. But I see very few organizations where that's true.
Yeah.
things have to match on the interface, but they don't necessarily have to match everywhere.
Right. Nice. I heard you mention earlier that you said it's good when you're trying to nurture change, whether it's a team organization, to enable, ask, or get people's fingerprints on it. Do you mind giving some practical examples of what that might look like in a situation?
Well, so I was talking with someone several months ago who had designed this beautiful process to accomplish, I don't remember what it was, but she had completely designed this process that she then presented to the people who were supposed to carry out this process. And she got to the end of her very, very polished presentation where she told them exactly how they would be doing their work, and then said, "Is there any feedback?" And everybody just kind of sat there. Her response was that was a deficiency on the part of the people who wouldn't speak up, but she didn't leave any room for them.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, she had this polished presentation with all the details worked out in her mind. I mean, I'm sure they were not actually accurate because she didn't know the day-to-day of the work, but there was no room for them to comment. So I think it's much, you involve people earlier. If you show people a proposal, you leave some rough edges on it, so there's something for people to smooth off, for them to have their input, to talk about what the actual day-to-day details are, because someone in a different role who has never done the job probably can't anticipate them all. So, I mean, that's one way. Involve people earlier in the process, have them help design it. Or did that answer your question?
That does a lot. And I guess I did have one follow-up question to that is, in context, by the way, that pattern I've seen work really, really well. And I applaud it. And I strive to do it all the time. And that's part of the joy of mob programming or collaborative work, is that once you reach a level of candor and psychological safety, you're expressing half-baked ideas, you're leaving rough edges, and you're working it out collaboratively as a group. I saw a tweet the other day that was talking about writers for a TV show or movie, and they sit around a table and they're just throwing out half-baked ideas, and then they're collectively kind of writing the script together. And I'm not sure that's how it's always done, but at least in some TV shows and movies, that's how it's done. And so I've seen it work really, really well in, for technical product development as well. The one thing I've seen it hit a ceiling is when it's in an organization where leaving any rough edges or leaving something not full all the way thought through is then seen as a negative thing for whoever did that, right? So if you're in a meeting, if you're in a discussion, if you're in a presentation, and you decide to open it up, hey, let's decide this one thing together, this one piece, or let's leave something open-ended for, the group to figure out, or half-baked even. It's seen as like, oh, you're not doing your job on thinking this all the way through. Therefore, I think less of you now in this role you're doing. And so any advice for that difficult situation? Yeah.
Well, I think you have to kind of read the situation you're in, and if you're in a situation where you take something to the people who are going to approve it and they expect perfection, then you try to get it as well done as you can, but maybe you involve people before you show it to them, right?
Yeah, I think one thing that I'm reminded of is I did a workshop with Esther and Don Gray and years ago, and that was really good. And one of the things that I quote often, and I think I've quoted on this show often, is the center, enter, turn dynamic, and this idea that once you're part of the system, it's a little bit easier to change the system. But first you need to understand it and become a part of it, and then shift it, once you have that buy-in. And so sometimes even if you may disagree with the mechanics of what they're doing, I find that going through that exercise a few times to then have influence about the process, so that you can make that suggestion is a really powerful thing. And Esther, I took that that quote directly from you, and I think it's served me very well, across the years here. So those.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, to a certain extent, you become the system you're in, right? You take on some of the assumptions of that, and it takes some practice to kind of separate yourself from the system, right? And maintain some observer view about what is the system I'm in and what behavior is it influencing, so that you can remain more choiceful. So if I were in a situation where, coming in with something that didn't look polished was going to be career limiting, I might make it look polished, but I might, approach it differently when I was putting things together. And I might then talk about, I didn't come up with this all on my own. I had a lot of input from other people who brought really good ideas and helped make it a much more robust proposal or candidate or whatever it is, which is less risky than going in with something that's not polished. I mean, you may still run into someone who is stuck on the idea that it's all individual effort and doesn't realize that most marvelous innovations have come through collaboration and juxtaposition of different ideas that they're still very wedded to this idea of the the lone genius or coming up with this stuff, which our culture tends to love that idea.
Yeah. And I was kind of in a situation just like that, where it was like extremely high stress, high visibility, must be perfect. And my strategy in that particular scenario was to go to all the people I knew were the biggest detractors of the idea and get them involved in working on it one-on-ones. Like I just did one-on-ones with the people that I knew just utterly hated the idea and just get as much of their feedback as possible, incorporate it into the solution. Because I think a lot of the time, it's different if the person won't give you the time of day. It's a lot of the times people will disagree with you openly, but they don't hold anything against you. And so finding those people can be a very powerful mechanism in that regard.
Yeah, that's a really interesting strategy, because one, they may have legitimate reasons to be concerned about it, about the idea, and then it's great to learn about what those are, and maybe you haven't thought about this aspect of it, but if they invest a little time in you, right, by having that conversation with you, that's an investment, and so then they care more about their investment, right? And there's a reciprocity that starts there that can really result in much more support for an idea. So I think that's a really great strategy.
Yeah, and light bulb just went off for me that so I was gonna restate what you and Esther, what you and Chris were saying, that like, okay, if perfection polished is expected, you do it for a while until you're part of the system, and then you can suggest it differently. And I really liked what Chris and you said about involving people earlier. And it reminds me of something in a previous organization that was seen as an anti-pattern, but maybe it's a necessary anti-pattern as like a incremental step to the bigger change, which was, it was called the meetings before the meetings. So because the high risk meeting was the one where, maybe not perfection, but very polished. I'm not just giving problems. I got to give solutions to every problem that comes up. It's like this very like high expectation for this presentation or discussion or meeting, right? It's definitely not expected to be a collaborative, discover together type meeting. And so what people did is they would have a lot of meetings before the meeting so that when it came time for the performance, basically everyone at the meeting has already worked on the idea, worked on the problem, and so basically no one's hearing anything new. It's just this performance for everybody, but covertly people have worked collaboratively to have this performance at the end. And my gut feel is that overall it's an anti-pattern, because it's an environment where you're expected to not collaborate and just to deliver individualistically. But maybe it's a baby step to a grander change. I'm not sure. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, it sounds like people were collaborating. They just didn't call it that.
Yes.
You know, so on one hand, it preserves the illusion that people had. Not necessarily a good thing, but you know, collaboration was happening. It just was, as you said, it was happening covertly. Which reminds me of another story, because I've got a lot of stories of an engineering company. So it was a pretty heavily engineering, male-dominated workplace, and they had a very admirable commitment to hire more women. They hired more women, and then they would say, some of the people would say, well, I don't know, we hired these women, but they don't know how to have a fight. And they don't know how to, they're conflict averse. But what was happening was that they were doing something similar to what you described. So they would be going and getting input. Both of you described it in different ways. They'd be going around and getting input, talking to people and bringing them along and incorporating their ideas and getting them on board. So they didn't have these big blow-ups, you know. So that's how they managed conflict, right? They listened, they incorporated ideas, they collaborated, and then they were in some ways penalized for it, because it didn't match the expectation of how people did conflict. So fortunately, there were people in that organization who stood up for those the women in there and said, yeah, no. They do it in a different way. You can't hire for diversity and then expect people to be exactly like you. It doesn't work that way.
And I love that. I think it's good. I think, at least for myself, and I've seen with others, is, like you said, there are hard and fast rules for organizations. Like, right, you know, there are a limited set of those things, right? Like, don't threaten people, you know, kind of these universal rules, so to speak. But then I think a danger comes when that area of hard and fast rules, universal rules, get brought into things that aren't that, right? You're taking, you know, areas where there's multiple ways to accomplish the same goal and making a universal judgment about it, right? And I think at least a growth area for me has been opening up, like, okay, there are multiple ways to have healthy conflict, right? There's not one way, right? You know, and so I think being open to experiment and try different ways to accomplish that. And I think it's something I've noticed in general with people, is that there's this desire to have binary answers for everything, when, especially in engineering and organizations, there's a lot of non-binary answers. There are binary answers in some things, but there's a whole range of things, especially in development, working with people, experimentation, that it's more proverbial and more experimentation and more try and do. And I think, at least for me, helping people and myself see that, hey, maybe this isn't a universal law. Maybe there's another way to do this, you know.
Well, I mean, when there is one correct solution, it makes sense to, and only one correct solution, it makes sense to do that. But you know, and there are domains where that is appropriate. Yes. You know, but there's, you know, most of the work that we do isn't in that domain. Some of it is, but most of it isn't. Yeah. And I think that actually causes a lot of problems in organizations, where they try to apply a solution that will fit a simple, obvious domain, but they're in a complex domain. It causes endless problems. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time. We're starting to hit the end of our time box, but you know, I've learned a lot from this. Is there anything you'd like to share and plug before we close out this episode? Well, If you're interested in learning more about how to adjust the environment so that people can be more creative and effective, whether you're a manager or not, you might want to come to my PSL workshop, Problem Solving Leadership. We're working on the schedule for one in October, and we will probably open registration in July. So if you want to hear more about that workshop, shoot me an email at esther@estherderby.com.
Awesome. Thanks again so much for being on the show. It's
My pleasure. It's nice to talk to you both.
Awesome. Right on. And so to our audience, we'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics. How do you define management? How do you think management should be rethought? How do you think change should be nurtured? What are ways you've seen help people get their fingerprints on change and, things like that. And so please like and subscribe. Please share this episode with someone you think it could help or inspire a conversation with. And until next time, have a good one, everybody, and talk to you later. Bye.